these objects are so much more than stone or metal, that they're community, that their
Mm,
representation, that their identity, that their
yeah.
history and their memory and their family and values and heritage. And those are deeply held identities for people.
Hello, everyone. This is Miles Desilo back again for the Monumental Project on behalf of the Monuments Toolkit and USI Combos. Today we have once again a very special episode of the show. Last month we had a great conversation with Hamza Walker and Hannah Bernstein from LAX Art on the relationship between public art, history, and addressing our nation's toughest issues. Please check that out when you get the chance. This month we had the chance to speak with Bonnie McDonald from Landmarks Illinois. As the president and CEO of Landmarks Illinois, Bonnie advances the vision, mission, and programs of the organization. Her innovative approach to preservation and history has led Landmarks Illinois to its efforts in preserving people and their vital link to historic sites. Additionally, Bonnie was instrumental to the Chicago Monuments Project, one of the best citywide campaigns focused on monuments of oppression. We spoke on the groundbreaking values of Landmark Illinois, incomplete views of history, and how other cities can tackle the same issue with success. We hope you enjoy the conversation. Here we go. Hello, Bonnie. How are you doing today?
I am fine, Miles. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sitting down with us. I guess to start the conversation, can you please give a brief introduction to yourself and the work that you do?
Yes, I'm happy to. My name is Bonnie McDonald, and I am the president and CEO of Landmarks Illinois. And Landmarks Illinois is the statewide historic preservation nonprofit organization. And we like to talk about ourselves as people saving places for people. So we
Mm,
see the work of historic preservation as a practice in working together with people and communities to save the places that are important to them,
mm,
to providing tools, resources, technical assistance, grants, know-how, anything that people need to ensure that the places that tell their stories are, preserved, revitalized, reused. And we've been doing that for 51 years.
wow, wow,
Mhm.
wow. That's amazing.
Mhm.
Yeah, so Landmarks Illinois is, like you said, the only statewide preservation nonprofit organization. I would call that a pretty big title, and I'm sure in a lot of ways, a pretty big responsibility. In your mind, what are some values that you and your team stand by to do right by Illinois and their citizens?
Well, thank you. Yes, we actually live by 4 values, but then I also would like to talk about our guiding principles as well.
Mm,
So, ultimately, our values are pretty simple, but they represent a tremendously important aspect of our work, which is I would call it self-determination. So,
mm,
people's ability to determine what stories are told about them and their communities, educating people about the all of the narratives that
mm,
represent the history of people in our state, in the many cities that we have,
right.
and ensuring that it's not the architectural historians that are deciding what's significant, because you might be able to see architectural history, but you can't see history.
Mm,
And so it's also a working together with people to identify the stories, the narratives, the identities represented by a place, and then also trying to be respectful about gaining trust and permission to help to tell that story, because it's
right.
not always our right to tell another person's history.
Yeah, definitely.
So I would say that's indicative of our value to be innovative. And sometimes the world doesn't see historic preservation as tremendously innovative.
Mm,
In fact, they would say it's pretty counterintuitive. But we like to think that we're always looking at ways to do our work better, and that also speaks to our value for education.
mm,
Being able to speak about, to tell history is really teaching us about how we can be better people.
right.
Decisions that we've made in the past, those that were triumphant, and how can we use those to help us, of course, to make better decisions today, more just decisions today. And then, to an extent, I'll use the word, we believe in the value of empowering people and improving lives. And to empower, though, it's really about making sure that the tools, the resources that a person needs to save a place that's important to them is accessible, freely accessible to them, that we're not serving as a gatekeeper to resources, but really as, somebody who makes them easier to find, and hopefully, people won't need us in the future to find them. They'll be able to do that on their own.
Right.
And then, improving people's lives is, I think, very much about supporting what a community envisions for itself, for its own future and what it values. So I would say that those encapsulate our values, and sustainability would be the fourth one. Also looking at historic preservation as a way to fight climate change, and promote environmental justice, and doing that as a measure to sustain the resources that we have, the embodied energy in them, and then to try to help the world decarbonize by making them more energy efficient if we can. So that's a long description for four very otherwise short-worded values.
Right.
And then we apply a set of guiding principles, which is our code of conduct for how we behave in the world, how we act, and those are available on our website at landmarks.org.
Wow. Thank you so much. That was a great description.
Thank you.
I really liked accessibility, of course, but also like when you talked about innovation. I think a lot of people, like you said, kind of see innovation and historic preservation as like an oxymoron, like kind of setting your values, what people kind of think about with historic preservation. But like you said, it's really important to constantly be changing and trying to evolve different ways on how to preserve history. I think it's really important. Just from looking at the work that Landmark Illinois does, you guys do a great job of that.
Thank you so much. I'm glad that you picked out the word. You named it yourself, Miles, by saying the word evolve. And because I would say that history is really about our evolution as people, as humanity, as a civil society. And that in order to truly reflect I think the best and the worst of humanity, history itself is an evolution. And we're always looking at ways to, I think, go back and learn and reinterpret what has been interpreted in the past, because history is not neutral. History has a point of view, and I know we'll be talking about that today.
Yes, most definitely. From there, I really want to hop into the topic of conversation, which is the Chicago Monuments Project. So you are the co-chair of the Chicago Monuments Project, an important and comprehensive project focused on Chicago's racial history in relation to its municipal art collections. What was the process of bringing this, entire project to fruition?
Yes, this project it really is indicative of the innovation that we were just talking about. And I really would like to give credit to Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot for being courageous about this process of evaluating public space and what we feel should be reflected in public space, because many other cities that have gone through this process in the United States have essentially picked one monument or a small number, a handful of monuments.
Right.
And if people know the city of Chicago, you might have heard of the Chicago Plan, or what's called, Daniel Burnham coined the phrase "make no little plans," and that was about Chicago. And I think this project is truly indicative of that aspect: make no little plans. So Mayor Lightfoot was responding to a protest in 2020 around the Christopher Columbus monument. There are three Christopher Columbus monuments in the city that were in the public's ownership, part of the municipal collection. And the Columbus Monument in Grant Park, which is the park right on the Lake Michigan lakefront, was the subject of public protest before, but especially after the murder of George Floyd. And there, the protests became increasingly, increasingly there was violence between protesters and police, and there was concern about general public safety. And so the mayor had the Christopher Columbus Monument in Grant Park removed, taken down, and put into storage. And it could have ended there. I mean, there could have been just the end of the conversation that it was a public safety issue. But I think here's where the courage came in, is to identify that this was not the only monument that needed to have a reevaluation, needed to have an exploration of the histories that it was telling, the narratives,
Right.
whose point of view was represented or not represented. And so she working with the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events here, and two other agencies, Chicago Public Schools and the Parks Department, charged them with evaluating the entirety of their collection, their artwork collection. Wow. To come up with a criteria, to evaluate them, and then to select those that needed really further interrogation, so to speak, further exploration, and to go about doing that, and to select what was going to happen to them. She created an advisory committee, and I was proud to be named as one of the 3 co-chairs of that committee, to work together to bring our unique perspectives and skill sets to what is essentially a very difficult conversation about identity and symbolism in our public space.
Right. Wow. Really, really amazing stuff. Really, really amazing stuff. And like you said, it would have been easy to stop at the surface level after the Columbus Monument and just kind of say we're done. But it really takes a courageous, kind of vision to be, start peeling back the layers and, maybe unturn some of the not so nice stuff about your own city, but it's the work that has to be done. So shout out to Mayor Lightfoot and everyone who's been involved on this project for sure.
Thank you, Miles. I would like to take the opportunity early in this conversation just to give credit to the 30 people who participated on this advisory committee for 2 years. It took us 2 years to develop our recommendations, our report. We took our time to have a public engagement process that was, I would say, it was broad and deep at the same time. It was intentional. And intentional around inviting conversation with people represented in these monuments and not represented in these monuments, and to work with artists, to have conversation about what is a monument, what does it symbolize, and new work. So I'm excited to talk with you about all of these perspectives, because they're very different from what other cities have done in our approach. But just to say thank you to the advisory committee members, the staff at these 3 agencies, and then also the public, because we had over 3,000 people who commented or participated in our different opportunities for community engagement.
Wow. That is great. We're definitely going to get more into the public engagement and the representation in a minute. But to start, at least from a research perspective, US ICOMOS is doing something really similar with the Monuments Toolkit and the idea of identifying problematic pieces of history. One of the things we did first was define things like monuments of oppression, status quo, and recontextualization to kind of help us develop a framework for what we're about to do. The pillars of the Chicago Monuments Project talk on considering monuments and memorials that are promoting incomplete, distorted, or harmful pieces of history. In your opinion, what is an incomplete view of history, and what are some indicators that a monument or statue isn't necessarily telling the whole story?
Well, we have these founding narratives that are pervasive in our nation. I think they exist around the world. When you think about settler colonialism, and in history, there's that adage of that history is written by the winners, quote unquote. I don't know if there are winners. There are winners and losers. When certainly anyone is displaced from their home, when acts of genocide are perpetrated to remove people from their homeland, and then also those who make their place and do so without really any context about where they live, how they came to be there, other than the narratives that they've been told, and the narratives we teach in our history, the pedagogy of how this nation came to be. It really tells one or two perspectives on how that came to be. And so incomplete means, in my mind, I mean, this was not a definition by any means of the Monuments Project, but incomplete is essentially missing the other perspectives about how something that we live in today came to be, how people came to be or not, or no longer in a place, and that how that happened, what circumstances were surrounding that, what in many cases intentional or unintentional violence or terrorism that was perpetrated on people living in a place, or who were brought to a place. So we talk about monuments here as promoting narratives of white supremacy, and this needs to be talked about. We have this history in our nation that we need to address, we need to discuss, and the monuments that are only telling one perspective and really celebrating one person's perspective are not educating the public in a truthful manner. And I think we all, I hope we all want the truth about this place where we live.
Definitely. That's a great answer. Thank you for that. Moving back to what you're talking about, public engagement. So one of the pillars, like you said, of the Monuments Project is to create a platform for the public to engage in civil dialogue about Chicago's history. How responsive has the city of Chicago been with the project? Have there been any particular memorable interactions between the project and the public? What has been the relationship between the Chicago Monuments Project and the citizens of Illinois?
I would, I believe that, let me just go back for a moment to say that the project did not limit itself to only citizens of Chicago. So I think it's important to note that anyone around the world could comment on we had a website, essentially form where people could log their comments, and we had comments coming from across the world, because some of the artworks that we were engaging with were actually done by artists not living in the United States at the time. And there were people who care about these monuments from other parts of the world as well. And so we did try to focus, though, on people who would call themselves residents of the city, living in the city, spending time in the city. And to try to be intentional about that process, we knew that the website could not really control for that, where people were living, and we wanted to hear from people from wherever they were living or staying. And but we created a platform by having intentional public programming. And so we worked with partner organizations, partner nonprofits, and community groups to ask them to put on programming that they felt would be relevant to this conversation from whatever point of view, perspective, within their mission. And so there were I believe, if I'm right, around 17 of those public programs. And then we had an additional 20 or so meetings with groups that represented those, I think we'd say who are, represented in the monuments themselves, whether by their own choice or not. And to ensure that we were speaking directly with, the American Indian community. And if I may say to your listeners that was the choice of representatives on the advisory committee to use the words American Indian, to ask us to use the words American Indian as a way to take back that legal term, because it legally refers to a person who has tribal rights. So that's why I use the words American Indian intentionally. So there were meetings with the Italian American community, several of those people coming from different perspectives, as well as historic preservation, the community I was representing in this
Right.
group, and several others. So I just would say that I think the public engagement process was certainly intentional. I've used that word, maybe overused that word, but trying to be thoughtful about inviting the voices of everybody and anybody who has a stake in these monuments, but also engages with them, whether on a daily basis or not, because we're affected by the things that we see,
Right.
whether we might notice them or not. And once you bring attention to them, then I think it brings even more notice into people's lives. And that is when we saw, I think, additional comment by people when we started talking about these monuments.
Thank you. Thank you. That was perfect. That actually leads perfect right into my next question. So many of the monuments in question center like on the depiction of American Indians. To the average person and passerby of some of these statues, a monument of an American Indian usually a good thing, at least for the sake of recognition. The database online does a good job of explaining this, but can you explain to our listeners why a lot of these monuments are still a bit problematic?
Yes, thank you. I will certainly interpret it as, using the criteria that we set forward, and we referenced one of them already, which was promoting narratives of white supremacy.
Right.
And when white supremacy can appear in these by having the perspective of the life, the beliefs, the depiction, identity of an American Indian person, but it's from the perspective of a white person. And so it's really the lens, a lens that's focused on someone who it is not you, and creating a depiction of their life without the knowledge, and in many cases without their permission. So that also works into our criteria that, presenting these narratives being stories, narratives being the actual depiction of of bodies, of what bodies look like,
Right.
and the inaccuracy and oftentimes demeaning depictions and characteristics of American Indians. So if listeners go to see our report, they will see monuments where American Indians are placed in submissive positions. Submissive to missionaries, for example, in the Joliet and Marquette monument. So putting them in subservient and demeaning positions within the work of art themselves. Memorializing individuals who perpetrated acts of genocide or slavery. And in this case, the Sheridan Monument is relevant or germane because Philip Sheridan was part of the government's removal acts after the Civil War to remove American Indians from their land, and essentially to perpetrate treaties that were done under false pretenses, and essentially stolen land. And so that's not presented in these works. Oftentimes the position of the person is being celebrated for, some act they did in their life, like in the case of Sheridan and being a general in the Civil War. But yet people are more than just one act. They have an entire lifetime of perspectives and acts, and that's what makes depictions of human beings so problematic, is that they are not one-dimensional. So I would say that's, this sort of presentation of selective history is also problematic. And oftentimes in the 41 monuments that we selected out of the over 500 works of art that were evaluated, a good number of them were depictions of American Indians.
Similarly, Chicago, of course, is home to one of the largest urban, populations of American Indians in the United States, with like over 70,000 residents. There are a lot of organizations in the city centered around indigenous advocacy, like the Field Museum, AIC, et cetera. In the process of creating this project, you touched on this a little bit, of course, but was there a working relationship with any of these organizations to create the best outcome, and how did those processes really start?
Well, I would like to certainly give respect and credit to Shy Nation, which is a youth American Indian organization here, because Shy Nation was part of the advocacy and activism around the protests around the Christopher Columbus Monument, and their voices were very important in raising these conversations. So I do want to ensure that the young people who have been courageous in this process are recognized. And you mentioned the Field Museum, and we did have Alaka Wali, who is really the curatorial and community liaison for the American Indian program within the Field Museum, was a member of the advisory committee as one voice. We also were proud to have the participation of John Lau, Professor John Lau, who is an enrolled member of the Pokagon Potawatomi, those who were living in Chicago during the settler colonial era. Although I think people would say we're still in the settler colonial era. So to ensure that we had a voice of the Pokagon Potawatomi, as this is their ancestral home, and people are still living here. There's a wonderful artistic there's a wonderful piece of art, I should say, an installation by Anishinaabe artist Andrew Carlson, who was not a member of the committee, but it's a piece that was supported by a grant from the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events called "You Are on Potawatomi Land," and it's there's a photo of it in the report. Just to remind people that we are on Potawatomi land, so-called ceded and unceded land. So that we were pleased to have numerous American Indian voices, Cynthia Soto, for example, and then there was outreach and specific conversations with the American Indian Center. There was a survey that was sent out through the American Indian Center to members of the organization to again try to elicit thoughts, concerns, responses, and make sure that, because the majority of these monuments had depictions of American Indian people, that American Indian voices were helping to lead the way about the response.
Wow, that's great. And I really think that's the best way to go about it. Make sure that the people who, were depicted in the negative way in the past gets to lead the conversation for the future. So thank you for making that a pressing point. So it's a bit of a lofty question, but what advice can you give to other cities who might be starting to deal with their own racial history, especially from a public art perspective, but don't really know how to necessarily start that journey? I know you're not, Mayor Lightfoot, but I feel like you would still be great to answer this question.
Well, I appreciate that, Miles. So I am a resident of the city of Chicago. I work in this place as well as across the state of Illinois, and live here. And I would say that my voice as a citizen is important, and that is key to any community who wants to begin a dialogue about race and injustice, white supremacy, depictions of, and continuing continued segregation, systemic racism, is to ensure that there's a thoughtful approach to why this is being done, what are the intentions, who is involved, to go at the pace that the public needs to. I think this was pushed back in San Francisco when San Francisco proposed I think they not only proposed, they approved changing the name of several, I think it was elementary schools. Please
Right.
correct me if I'm wrong.
Mhm.
And that was announced, it is seemingly, I mean, who knows what's happening behind the scenes, but seemingly overnight.
Mm.
And, there was a backlash by, certain citizens, and I think they pulled that back. And what that said, I think to several of us who were working on this project was that the community hadn't been involved in that
Mm.
discussion. And the pace had been so quick that it caught certain people off guard or by surprise. And
Right.
there was a reaction instead of a proactive, slow, thoughtful process because really listening takes time.
Mm.
Listening to people takes time. It took us 2 years to come to the point where we felt confident to actually publish recommendations to be taken up by the three agencies that I talk about. So I would say that's number one, is just to be very transparent about intentions and process and who is at the table and why they're at the table and
Mm.
who they are purporting to represent, what voice. If you're having representational voices at the table, who set that table, who
Right.
had the power to set that table, and then taking time to go at the pace of conversation, go at the pace of that change can happen, which is slow, and
Mm.
to be patient, as patient as possible. The media, I would say, was not as patient with us, and we just had to stay the course
Right.
to ensure that we were listening. And then just to bring another part of our process to the fore, it was that the conversation in this particular case was not all about whether to remove or not. It was to identify problematic monuments, why they were problematic, and to bring forward histories that some people had never heard about, had
Mm.
never even never been taught. As we go back to that founding narratives, what we're taught about Abraham Lincoln and George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, and yet they have their own hypocrisies about sort of not emancipating, doing quite the opposite, or
Right.
being perpetrators of enslaving people,
Mm.
perpetrating genocide against people, while purporting freedom at the same time. And that's, I think these are the histories that we are talking about. And you take time and education to bring people into that conversation with, with information, with facts that they may never have heard before.
Mm. Mm.
And then to discuss new work at the same time, that this is not just discussions about what belongs and what doesn't, or removal or staying or contextualization, but for us, it was what is a monument? What do we want to memorialize in public space as a symbol of our values, as a symbol of the narratives that tell a complete history about the people in this amazing city and what they've contributed, movements that have contributed to building this nation, like the labor movement, which is not represented in our monuments.
Mm.
And new work is just as important, to think about working together with artists, with organizations, with multiple communities, to talk about what they would want representation to look like, what to memorialize as symbols of our history and our identity.
Mm. Mm. Wow. What an answer. Wow, that was great. Usually our final question is how do we address monuments of oppression? But what you just said with transparency and pace and education and bring in new work, I feel like you already answered the question. So thank you for the 2-for-1. Thank you so much, Bonnie, for the work that not only you do with Landmarks Illinois, but also the work you've done with Chicago Monuments Project, and of course being a part of our show. It really means a lot for us, seeing other organizations do work that we do, because it shows that we're not like in a silo for thinking the way we think or trying to fulfill some of these missions that we're trying to carry out. There's still people who are across the country doing the same thing and doing it well. So thank you. It means a whole lot.
Yeah, Miles, thank you for the work of US ICOMOS, as really having important discussions, having collective discussions about what we want to have in our public space together as a shared space, and that these objects, so to speak, are far more than that. If I could end on anything, it's been even more even more surprising than I thought I would be. As all of us watched the protests in Charlottesville and the violence perpetrated against protesters, the terror acts of terrorism against those who are protesting these monuments, that when having public conversations, truly taking in and being open to listening to people's how these objects are so much more than stone or metal, that they're community, that their representation, that their identity, that their history and their memory and their family and values and heritage, and those are deeply held identities for people, and so they can't be treated in a way that is flippant or expedient. It's disrespectful to people, and while hard at times to hear and to listen to perspectives that might not be your own, that these are dialogues that are very important to have, and they may not end in a conciliatory or in a note of agreement, but civil dialogue is part of a civil society. And so I hope that we have achieved or modeled that in some way, and our report does include minority reports, so to speak. I would say, perspectives that were not shared about the recommendations. And we invited that. We wanted to ensure that there was room for, I guess you would say, dissension, because it's an important aspect of democracy.
Definitely. Wow. Well, thank you once again. It means a lot, of course, for you being on the show. So thank you, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Miles. You too. I appreciate your time.
Thank you for listening to this month's episode. We'd like to thank the Andrew Mellon Foundation, the entire US ICOMOS team, and all of our listeners around the world for tuning in. If you'd like to share your thoughts on today's subject matter, feel free to email us at monumental@usicomos.org. We would love to hear your thoughts. As always, I'm Miles Ezilo. We'll talk soon.